Dear everyone, so today we are very glad to invite George from Goldsmiths, University of London, to share with us about a highly discussed topic, like towards a virtual self. Any question is quite welcomed today. So please type your question or raise your hand if you want to ask a question. We're quite free today in a relaxed way. And of course, there's no right or wrong. So I highly encourage everyone to speak out their opinion because it's like a discussion, not like a definition day. So please feel free to ask. So George will share with us his slides for today as leading questions actually. So it's like give us some clue or a bit of like background knowledge so we can start from there. Good. And then George is going to share the screen here. Good.
Sorry,
Fabulous. And
can you
yeah,
see the screen, Mr. Jack?
yes, I can see the screen. And also you can do a bit of yourself in introduction because I know your background is very interesting. You're coming from a motor neuron artist aspect, which is a dancer. So George is basically from a dancing, but maybe more. I know you play also piano and climb the mountain, like indoor mountain, like almost every week. Yes, tell us a bit about yourself before the topic. Yeah.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So like Victoria said, I'm a PhD student in psychology at Goldsmiths. And we kind of work in a more we kind of work in an interdisciplinary field because we work with a technology company, and so we work in human computer interaction. So it is a little bit of a combination between psychology or cognitive neuroscience, we could say as well, and computer science, in that we work with technology. So we need to look at the human side, but also the computer side, and how that works best for the interaction. And yet, I also have a little bit of dance background and some other stuff in the arts as well. But yeah, so we work in human computer interaction, and we typically in my project look at the sense of agency. But today we are going to look at a more specific topic of the virtual self. So yeah, before I get into introducing that, you can see the slides and they change as well, Victoria, just to check.
Yes, it's work.
Okay,
They're working. Yeah,
perfect.
perfectly. Yeah, see.
So today it's going to be a little bit more specifically on the virtual self. So looking at the self in virtual reality. We're going to look at this from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, or psychological and even philosophical, but also from the computer science perspective. So I'm glad to hear there are some people from that background, because you may even have more input than I do on some of these slides, and I'll be very glad to hear it. So the reason we're looking at this topic is, so there's an increasing accessibility and scope for VR applications, from things like neuro rehabilitation to educational training. It's used in medicine and surgical settings. And of course, probably everyone knows about gaming and entertainment as well. So therefore, we have this need to understand the onboarding of the self from the physical world to the virtual world, and how to do this appropriately and very well. And so this interdisciplinary approach offers a mutual benefit as well, because these VR systems offer a nice, like, systematic manipulation of the feedback that we can get and control for psychological experiments. So the research, because we often need to control certain variables very well. And then this kind of psychological research can also feed back into the understanding of the user in these virtual worlds, and offer a nice, concrete and robust scientific approach to measuring and understanding the virtual self. So that's basically the topic today. We're going to explore questions on each slide. Not going to be too much information or too many slides. It's going to be quite discussive, so I'll explain certain things. And as Victoria said as well, please do ask questions per slide as well, as I want it to be quite discussive. So the first question we'd explore is, what exactly do we mean by the virtual self? Well, we interact with virtual worlds using our own body. And of course, therefore, the boundaries of the bodily self are important. So in human-computer interactions, our actions and their effects extend beyond the immediate physical environment now, in that we can cause these effects within a system that's beyond just our physical um, existence. So where we might press a light switch and it will turn on the light in the physical environment, we can actually do this in a virtual environment now. We're actually causing effects within that environment that go beyond our immediate physical environment. And so as these technologies advance, our means of these interactions are continuously expanding, and they include navigating these virtual environments using our actual own body movements. So not necessarily just mediated with a controller or a mouse when using a normal computer and so on. And so we can actually navigate these worlds now with our body movements specifically. And so it becomes necessary to understand the boundaries of this bodily self, as it's normally tethered to physical laws and properties. But in the virtual worlds, we can manipulate this as we like, or try to target it to make it as physical as we want. But these boundaries of the bodily self can be blurred. And so two fundamental aspects of minimal self-awareness in psychology and philosophy that are closely tied to an ecological body. That is the sense of ownership over a body and the sense of agency, being able to act with a body. And these become very important then. So these are quite important things to consider when talking about the virtual self. So that's kind of what we mean. That's the kind of perspective I want to shift toward when we're talking about the virtual self. So the bodily self and this minimal self-awareness that comes with it. So ownership over the virtual body and the agency to act with a virtual body in these environments. So that's kind of what we mean by the virtual self. And I'd like to invite if anyone has any kind of questions, or if anyone wanted to expand on that or ask me anything about that as well, before we go on to the next slide.
So actually, thank you for explaining. I have a question. So is the virtual self more closer to our inner self, or the bodily self more closer to our outer self? I mean, the inner psychology myself, and how other people see us as our appearances. Like, how do you explain, like, how to matching that, or it's partially, yeah. So this is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it would be a slightly separate question if we talk about whether it's closer to our inner selves. That would probably refer to more to like our personality and how we see our character. But we're sticking more, I think, to the bodily self, which we will get onto as well. But yes, stuff like appearance, because you can, in fact, kind of tailor your avatar to whether you want it to be your own appearance or if you want to appear as someone else, or and so that, I suppose, you could tailor it to your own character, and then it will be interesting to see how that affects like our sense of ownership over the virtual avatar and our agency as well with the avatar, depending on its appearance. This kind of appearance can matter towards ownership and agency, which we will get to later on, which raises some interesting questions. But the extent to which it matters is something that's kind of being researched and is still something undergoing. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Good.
Okay.
Yeah. If anyone has any question, just type in the chatting box in Chinese or English. Better in English, but Chinese is also encouraged. So just let me know what I can help, or you can raise your hand so we can stop and answer your questions. Otherwise, let's move to the next slide. Okay.
Yes. So where I've talked about the virtual self and this minimal self-awareness, so then we might ask ourselves, well, what is the minimal self? And so Sean Gallagher, kind of philosopher and cognitive neuroscientist, talks about the minimal self as being irrespective of longer-term narratives built about the self. And so, as we can see here, something that they might call the narrative self is this kind of coherent image that we build up over time with memories of our past selves and our intentions about the future. And that might talk more to that kind of inner character as well. But something more immediate than this is us just as this subjective experience that we might call the minimal self. And this can kind of be pre-reflective as well. So it's in terms of how we experience ourselves as an immediate subject, and it's unextended in time. So it's quite closely related to the bodily self. Um, yeah, and we can be aware of it, or we can also not be aware of it. And there is a distinction at this level of self-awareness between the sense of ownership and the sense of agency. So ownership refers more to our bodily experiences and our sensations, just generally about the body. But agency is more intrinsically tied to voluntary action. So the actions that we make with our body and the effects that they can cause. And so disruptions to this minimal self-awareness is seen in disorders such as, or illnesses such as somatoparaphrenia, which is a bodily sensation disorder of ownership where we might lose ownership over certain body parts, whether it's due to paralysis or other forms of losing sensations. We will get to that more on the next slide, where I'm going to go into ownership specifically. And also disruptions are seen in like disruptions to our sense of control, such as schizophrenia, or losing kind of agency over a body part as well, where we consider that we are not the ones moving our own body anymore. So these kind of disruptions to minimal self-awareness are seen in these clinical illnesses or disorders, and therefore it's kind of seen as quite an important part of psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Yeah, so that's kind of what we mean by the minimal self, just there.
Yeah,
I can
still, yeah, after explanation, I still didn't quite get the idea of the minimal self. So can you
yeah
like show us like, let's say, two examples, like as normal people, as let's say as in dancing or other human behavior? Another example, like for example, like which kind of disease people like mismatching their minimal self with their former experience or narrative self. Can you like do some like detailed examples that would be helping for understanding?
yeah
Yeah.
yeah, this is quite difficult to explain in that sense, actually.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yes,
yeah, it's
that's
quite a
quite
philosophical
challenging. That's why
concept.
I asked you to explain.
uh,
Yeah, good.
um so yeah, so it's very closely tied to its ecological body. So I mean, we have experiences, let's say in the narrative self, where we have memories of things that have happened in our past, or things we remember about our interactions with people, and we kind of build up this image, and then we have these thoughts and intentions about the future. And these are quite higher level abstract things about our identity of the self. I guess maybe it's more closely related to the identity that we build ourselves. So the culture that we're from, the ethnicity that we're from, or um, the things that we have read or studied, and the knowledge that we gain. That's the kind of high level, I suppose, like the narrative self. So, maybe I study psychology. I'm from a Greek Cypriot kind of background. This kind of thing might be the narrative that I build about myself, or the experiences I've had from like parental input growing up and so on, and then what I want to do in the future. Maybe that's kind of an example of this narrative that I build up about myself and how I might explain myself to others. But before all of that, and even from such a young age, we actually start to learn about ourselves as an immediate subjective experience, like very closely tied to our body. Like as babies are learning this kind of sensory motor learning as they grow up, as they move, if they feel this internal motor movement, moving their hands in certain directions, they can follow it visually, and we kind of build up this uh, thing about the self that, oh, if I'm moving my hand to the left, I can see it moving to the left, it's moving in correspondence. Maybe if I go to touch something, as I come into contact with it or impact, I can feel the touch at the same time, the tactile feedback. It's very closely related to like sensory feedback, and just that very immediate subject of experience, whether even I'm aware of it or not. Because even when you're young, maybe you're not aware of having this kind of, if you're in your early months of living and so on, you don't necessarily know yourself as a body and that your body is experiencing this and so on just yet, but you are experiencing this kind of bodily sensations regardless. And even babies, once they get to a certain age, they can learn that they have a certain agency in the world as well. Where if they, roll a ball forward, that ball starts to roll forward, and then it gets to the next destination. And so they do start to understand that they are causing this as well, whether they are aware of it or not. And I think that is why it gets quite important, because it can be pre-reflective as well. This kind of immediate minimal self. I hope that kind of gives some sort of
Yeah.
more of explanation.
Yeah, a little bit
Um,
clear. As I'm coming from a neuroscience background, I would say maybe the minimal self is quite linked to the short term learning and memory behavior, like quite instant. And the
mhm,
narrative self
mhm,
is quite like a long term memory and like
mhm,
already formed experience. So you can go back and memorize it and record yourself because of like the former experience you have been experiencing.
mm.
Is this what I'm understanding? Is that right? Or
Yeah, I think so. And they can actually interact a little bit as well, in the sense that so we tend to build up these maps in our mind of what happens when we use our motor behavior to interact with a certain object or a certain um, thing in the environment. What will happen to that object, and what the feedback that we will get. And that is some of the models of sense of agency, which we will come to discuss, to include that kind of map that we build up over time. Um, and then whether the effects that happen on the environment are matching our internal map um, of action and effect as well. So
I
yeah, they
see.
probably interact.
Yeah, thank you. And
Um,
here we got a question from the chatting box. Can you see that? From
I
Shao
can't see the chat.
Jiawei.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Shao. Can you see it in the chatting box or you are sharing the screen?
Yeah, I think because I'm sharing both screens of mine are active at the moment, so I can't see it.
Okay, so this is from, but can you check your WhatsApp at some point? Can
Let me see
you
if I
have
can
your,
open up.
if you have your WhatsApp, I
Mm,
can send a photo to you or I can read
hold
it
on.
out. Yeah.
Wait, there might be a way I can.
Yeah, I already
Mm,
sent to your WhatsApp. Can you see it
yeah.
or I can just read it? You can check. So yeah, I suppose
Yeah,
you still
that's
have a
fine.
one phone. This is what we do with the online thing.
Yeah, yeah.
We need seven devices to do a webinar. Yeah.
So
Mm,
someone said, I would like to ask a question about
yeah.
boundary perception. How can we minimize the feeling of not being able to integrate into the virtual world when we enter it? Just like when we play some VR games, we sometimes can't even see our feet and feel like we don't belong to the virtual world and can't immerse ourselves. Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Mm,
Here's something we will actually discuss as well on some of the later slides, but I suppose I can touch on it for now.
mm,
Um, so yeah, it turns out this kind of feeling of owning the body is quite robust to some circumstances. So we might not necessarily need to see our feet in the world to be able to feel this ownership over the body and be able to interact. Sometimes the hands are enough, but what might impact it, which I won't go too into detail because we will go into in one of the later slides, is whether if we looked down and certain parts of the body aren't where they should be, but not because we just can't see it, but because we should be seeing it and it's not there. So something like discontinuity of the arms. So if we just have hands that are disconnected from the arms completely, even when you look down and there should be an arm there, that sort of thing can affect this sense of owning the body. Um, but if we do have hands and arms and maybe these are occluded by certain information, so let's just say you can't see the feet just because it's occluded, even like you just can't see that boundary, um, then it shouldn't affect ownership too much. As if you look somewhere and there should be something to do with a body part and it's not there. This can affect it. Yeah, and it might be more to do with the human likeness of the features as well. And you can also explore that from the third person as well. So we know that we can look at our virtual avatar from a third person, in which case maybe you would see the full body, and you can still kind of feel that sense of ownership over the body as well. But yeah, in first person, some of those discrepancies might affect it more. But yeah, I won't go into too much detail because we will get onto that later, and hopefully later on it answers the question. And if not, please, yes, ask again as well. But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to go on to the sense of ownership next as well, which hopefully
Yes.
that as well. So we're going to explore each of these sense of ownership and agency separately. So we're going to first look at the sense of ownership. And so sense of ownership is referred to as kind of experiencing a body as one's own, in the sense that it's not implied simply because one has a body that they feel ownership over a body, because this is seen in certain disorders, which we'll get onto as well. And so this sense of mindness is key here, so that you have to feel a body is yours, and that the sensations and the experiences related to it are relative to yourself. So yeah, it has to feel like the body is yours to give this kind of sense of ownership over a body. And so the reason why mindness is key, as we were saying, so in a disorder such as somatoparaphrenia, a patient might start to feel disownership over a body part that is actually their body part. So if they feel a sense of like paralysis, or something that's happened to the somatosensations that might come from touch to a body part, so they don't really feel as much anymore, even though the limb would still be theirs. If they have this other sort of hemiplegia, I think it's called, or neglect, they might doubly now kind of feel disownership over the body part. So they could be sitting there and their left arm is sitting there while it's paralyzed. It's still part of their body, but they feel this sense of disownership of, and they can deny owning this body part, and even to the extent of confabulating whole stories of why this body part is not theirs and maybe who else this body part actually belongs to. And so we know that it's a very real thing where this sense of mindness over a body part is quite important, where you can actually feel disownership of your own body parts and even assign ownership to someone else of a body part that should be quite clearly yours. And so it's a fundamental aspect in recognizing one's bodily experiences and sensations as part of the self. And that's why it's important to psychology. We know things that affect ownership is its internal and external bodily sensations that are relative to the sensory feedback that you might receive. And so the methodology when you want to investigate ownership is to measure these bodily experiences that we have and our perception, whether it's self-reported or found in a more implicit manner, of our bodily ownership when we manipulate these bodily sensations that we can have via sensory stimuli. So that is like key to the methodology when you're trying to measure it. So you want to manipulate the feedback that someone gets relative to their body, and then measure their experiences relative to these bodily sensations that you can induce. So a clear one that we know of, a clear methodological paradigm, is the rubber hand illusion, by Botvinnik and Cohen. And so what this experiment does is attempt to make a fake hand feel as part of the participant's own body. And the way they do this is place it in a position which makes it quite relative to the participant's bodily position next to their real hand, and then move their other real hand out of the way, out of the view. And so now naturally already they are sitting in a place where their perspective is almost taking on this fake hand as part of their own body. And to further induce this, they use a multisensory integration technique where they would use a brush or any sort of object to brush the fake hand and brush the real hand at the same time in synchronicity. And so the participant begins to feel and see like tactile and visually something on the fake hand, which starts to correspond to exactly what they're feeling on their fake hand, on their real hand, sorry. And when they train this up over time, the participant should then start to feel an ownership over this hand. And then so in these experiments, the way of measuring this then would be, one is a clear version of like self-report. So, you know, how much you feel an ownership over the hand? Do you feel this hand is yours? Do you feel it's part of your own body? And then do you feel it's located where your real hand is? So they would ask kind of self-report questions like that. There are implicit ways of capturing this experience as well. One is called proprioceptive drift. So proprioception refers to your sense of bodily position and kind of knowing where your hand or any limb is in space at a certain time. Oh, sorry, I think my camera's gone funny.
Fine.
How do I turn this?
Yeah, you're back. You're fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so they can use something called proprioceptive drift, where they ask participants to estimate where their hand is in space and measure where their hand is, and they tend to report having their real hand as closer to where the virtual hand is by reporting it in space. So they ask them to measure it, like ask where their real hand is, and it tends to be reported as closer to where the fake hand is. So that becomes a kind of implicit measure of this ownership over this fake hand. And I think the reason why as well they can find that is because if you train it in the wrong way, so if you brush the fake hand and the real hand asynchronously, so out of time, you tend to feel less ownership over this fake hand, and therefore they don't report their real hand as being as close to the fake hand, so it doesn't drift over as much in perception. You've also got psychological responses to threat, so they can see that once you've kind of felt an ownership over this hand using this integration of sensory feedback, when you threaten this hand with something, so if the experimenter knocks it with a hammer or threatens it with kind of some other sort of stress response, when you have successfully trained them to feel ownership over the hand, they might have a physiological response to this threat with skin conductance or even moving their real hand out of the way, as if they've just experienced this kind of threat or stress. And then you'll also see this marker in the brain as well, in the neuropsychological aspect as well. And so these are indicators that you can start to feel ownership over a hand that's not yours. So one thing with these measures as well is the implicit measures of the drift and the threat response do not always correlate with the self-reported measures of perception. And so some would suggest that this might be due to stuff like the wording of the report measures or the variations in measuring the drift. Alternative accounts might suggest a phenomenological distinction between explicit judgments or experiences of ownership. So the degree to which you believe this is actually your hand, or your degree of confidence that you might take ownership over a body part. And then this distinction between that and the implicit feelings of ownership. So your perception of your drift towards it, or your bodily sensations that react to the threat or stress response. So this very implicit level below the level of awareness. And that kind of relates to the distinction that we made earlier, where with the minimal self, you don't always have to be aware that you're experiencing something to actually experience it. And so there might just be a distinction between explicit and implicit levels of ownership, and this might be at the level of awareness. So we got some theory as well of ownership, where multisensory integration is the mechanism. So integrating the tactile and visual signals that you receive to your body or an external part if you're going to take ownership over it. But the difference is in the origins of the process. So some suggest a bottom-up process state, where these multisensory contingencies are sufficient, such that you can temporarily build this body schema, say, based on the correlations of your sensory information that you're receiving. Some might suggest top-down views, where we have this stable internal body map that we build over time. And then this multisensory information where you're stroking and seeing the hand at the same time is compared to a pre-existing stable body schema, which might have been the relative perception here. And so that would be a top-down theory. And then you've got unifying theories, which apply this kind of predictive account, suggest there's a continuous interaction of this kind of new multisensory information that you're seeing. And it's always interacting with the previous body map that we build as well. This kind of emphasizes a precision-based weighting of the sensory input to form the probabilistic representation of the bodily self. And then that's why, therefore, these representations are also malleable to contextual cues, such as maybe the look of the hand and so on. And that informs the probability that this body part is something that you own. So yeah, it's quite a bit on ownership, but hopefully makes a little bit of sense on this kind of what we mean by the sense of ownership over a body part.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Dr. Ruiming Lu. So he asked, if the artificial hand is replaced with something with a very different appearance, will it still have a similar sense of ownership?
Yes, so that's interesting, and that is something that virtual reality really helps with, actually, which we will get into a bit later, but I can touch on that quite briefly now. And so the answer is it matters to an extent. So as we can see, this, even the rubber hand here is quite different to his real hand, but it does still look human-like or anthropomorphic, we might say. And so he is still able to kind of take ownership over this body part. And the look of the hand, so long as it remains more human-like, can change in things like size and skin tone and so on. And you might still be able to take ownership over it. What might really affect it is if it changes to something non-human-like. So if it's a robot hand or a wooden block and so on, you might still get some sort of effect, but it will definitely dampen the effect. And so it's probably more to do with how human-like or anthropomorphic the hand is. And that is something we'll definitely be able to answer more later when we get to the virtual, because it's much more easy to manipulate the stuff in the virtual reality as well. But yes, that's a very good question.
Yeah, here the same person, Dr. Dr. Ruiming Lu asked, like in the hero movies, often demonstrate some characters with special functions, such as controlling, objects purely by mind. But he asked, he always have wondered whether is it possible to realize a seamlessly useless special function to let something outside of the body have a feeling instead of controlling its movement.
I just need to make sure I understand the question. So if someone's controlling something with their mind, would they feel ownership over the thing that they're controlling with their mind? I don't know if that's...
Let me take a photo.
That might actually relate more to the sense of agency. So the sense of actually controlling something and making actions and effects with it. So that might be a good cue to switch on to the next slide, where I'm actually going to talk about agent and how to dissociate as well, because it's quite a good question. It's quite important. And also for the sake of time, because I'm just realizing time as well. So so then we might ask then, which that becomes interesting. Then what is the sense of agency and why is it different exactly to ownership? So briefly, like this, the neurocognitive definition of sense of agency, because agency is quite a broad term and we can think of this in many ways, but just to bring it down to this perspective here, we want to look at it as where we initiate action to bring about change in the environment. So it's really our actions and the effects that they cause in the environment, and this is accompanied by this kind of subjective experience that we feel of a sense of agency over the effects that are happening here that are caused by our own actions. And so control and causation are key factors here, where you can use involuntary movement to dissociate it from ownership. So where we have seen with ownership that I, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, am experiencing this bodily movement, as we saw in the previous slide, movement or sensation, where things are happening to this hand. It's not voluntary in any way. You're not acting within any way, but you are feeling that sense of ownership over the hand. And then so with agency, sorry, that's in the way of the slide. The key is the voluntary movement, the voluntary action that we are making. That dissociates it from the sense of ownership. So there needs to be some sort of voluntary action or movement involved in this. And so this might be seen as a good example of something that we might call anarchic hand syndrome, where patients, unlike the dysownership, somatoparaphrenia, they might see a body part still as their own. Like, I know this is my hand and I know this is my body part. I know this is a funny image from a Jim Carrey movie, but I think it's quite a good analogy of what has been seen before in anarchic hand syndrome, where it's your body part and you're still taking ownership over it, but the things that are happening with this hand where it's moving, patients will say that it's not them causing or controlling the movement. Their hand is acting of its own will. And so that will and that voluntariness becomes very important. And we know that this can be disrupted. So it's somewhere separate going on. And so it's a central component of the self, which allows one to distinguish actions generated by the self from those generated by others. So we know that's why it's quite important in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And so when we're looking at the methodology of investigating this then, so it's largely contingent on signals related to intentional actions and consequential effects. And so then key to the methodology of investigating this is measuring experiences relative to the manipulations of feedback regarding our actions and effects. One way of measuring this, again, similar before, is using self-report, so manipulating something to do with our actions and the effects that they cause, manipulating the level of control or causation you have, and then asking participants to attribute their agency. So you can do this in a yes or no fashion. Like, did you feel agency over the movement? Did you cause this? And it could be a yes or no. If you want to get a more quantitative look at it, you might want to use a degree rating. So rate the degree to which you felt control or causal influence in a certain action effect event. So those are good explicit measures. And then we have some implicit measures as well. One is sensory attenuation. And so it was found that when there's an external cause of sensory information on the skin, so if someone else touches your hand versus when you touch your own hand, there's a difference in the intensity you experience of the sensory stimuli. So when you are the one causing and the action is self-generated, you tend to attenuate the sensory signal, so you don't experience it as intense. And so this is taken as an implicit measure. This is also seen at the neural level as well, where these signals are attenuated in the brain, and also at a physiological level as well, where your skin conductance is also attenuated. And so another implicit measure, and probably more widely used as well, is something called intentional binding. So when we have operant action, so if we make an action to cause an effect, the classic one is when you press a button and it causes a tone, a feedback, and you introduce a delay between the two. We tend to experience a compression of time between our actions and their effects. So we experience the time as being shorter between our actions and their effects when we feel more in control of the action, and we experience a longer time delay, or we perceive a longer time delay when we feel less in control of our actions. And so that's also taken as an implicit measure of agency, because it's something that's void of self-report. You don't need someone to report that. You can just kind of ask them to report how much time they feel went by between actions and their effects. Just for the sake of time, I won't go into exactly how that measurement was found, unless there are any questions on that. But so this implicit and these explicit measures, again, similar to ownership, don't always correlate. So this could be, again, a distinction between the implicit experience of agency and the explicit experience of agency. and possibly at the level of awareness. Again, this distinction is made quite often with minimal self. We don't always have to be aware. So although we might explicitly believe we are in control or are causing something, we might not always feel this at the implicit level, below that level of awareness, and vice versa. This could be a hierarchical aspect where our internal motor signals, that we are moving or we are causing something to move, might become less prominent in our feeling of agency when we have actually successfully completed a goal. So if we have successfully completed something we intended to do, whether it was in our control or not, might be less important at this kind of motor control level if the goal was completed anyway by some other way. So we've got some theoretical accounts of agency as well. There's something called the apparent mental causation theory, which is a very retrospective account of agency, where depending on the outcome of the effect that we intended to cause or didn't intend to cause would retrospectively influence our feeling of agency. So it's kind of a post-predictive aspect of agency where we wait until afterwards to determine whether we actually felt in control of that or caused it. You've got the comparator model as well, which is a more prospective mechanism. So we already have this internal map that we build, and when we go to make an action or do something to cause an effect, we've already got this internal signal, and then we are just going to, so it's a predictive account, and then we are just going to compare what happens back against this image that we've already built up. And then using that comparison, we will decide whether we actually controlled or caused an event. More recent accounts are a combination of both this retrospective and prospective mechanism. And we've seen now the Q integration approach, where it's a combination of both a predictive and a postdictive mechanism. And the influence of these cues are based on their reliability. So we know that the probability of an outcome happening would affect your sense of control, or sorry, your sense of control will be affected depending on the probability of the outcome caused. And also that external influences to our actions. So let's say the valence of an outcome, whether it causes a high tone or a low tone, or whether it's positive or a negative affect that happens based on your action, tends to affect people's sense of agency only if there was not a strong internal motor signal. So depending on whether your action was voluntary or involuntary would depend on whether the outcome actually affects it or not. It would probably affect it more if it was an involuntary action, affect your agency more. But if you are completely in control of your actions and it's a voluntary action, then the valence of the outcome may not affect that sense of agency as much. And so it's kind of an integrative approach into how we determine our sense of agency during actions and effects. But yeah, that's enough on agency for now before we can move on to the virtual self. Unless there are any quick questions on that.
I think we can just go through the slides first and then answer the questions later, since the time is a bit tight. Let's just make sure we cover all the possible aspects.
Yeah, for sure. So then how do we go from physical to virtual? So I can do this slide quite quickly, I suppose. So these VR technologies allow one to be an active user in a virtual space with virtual objects and so on, which responds to their bodily movements in a precise manner. So we might ask stuff like, what does the virtual self look like? What does it feel like? Is user representation important? So if we go from this left to the right, obviously in the physical world, it might just be a human hand, and here it's a slightly more line drawn hand and so on. So representing the user in terms of appearance, but we might also want to map their motor commands. So as the user moves to the right, does it precisely move to the right with them? And so does it map their commands in a precise manner? We might want to turn to the classic HCI model, which is the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation. So on the human side, when we make actions with intentions, they give us effectors, which should be read by the system, the sensors, and then the system attempts to change its state based on the human intentions. of effects, and then feed back to the user those kind of movements that have just been made. And then this is evaluated by the user at the level of perception. So that is one way of looking at how to go from physical to virtual. Yeah. And I guess something important to consider, a lot of VR research emphasizes something called embodiment, which kind of encompasses both ownership, agency, and also something as self-location. But as we've seen from previously, they can be quite separate constructs, sense of agency and ownership. And so it's quite important to study them separately and then also find out how they are dissociated. So yeah, that would be a quick one, how we go from physical to virtual, unless there are any quick questions.
I think we're fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can do. Yeah.
Okay, so just to get onto some more information, which hopefully covers some of those questions earlier. So, what do we know so far about the virtual self? What have we seen? So, we know that synchronicities between user motor signals and the feedback of the virtual signals are important. So, mapping those commands onto the virtual self. And so you might say the virtual body also being in line with the user's position, the user's movement, and the touch that they should feel according to their physical movements is important. And these can be referred to as sensory motor contingencies. So the contingencies of the sensory signals that you receive based on your motor and sensory signals in the physical world. And these are fundamental to the virtual self, such that the actions of the virtual self are carried out in accordance with the user's expectations, given their physical actions that they are making in the real world. So visual correspondence of our movements relative to our actual motor movements are something that we become accustomed to over time, as we talked about earlier, where we learn this from very young babies and kids start to develop this visual correspondence of their movements relative to their actual internal motor movements, and it's developed throughout the lifespan. So this is something that should really affect the virtual self quite well, and we know that it does. So we've seen asynchronous movements repeatedly have been shown in studies to disrupt this kind of sense of ownership and agency of a virtual avatar. There is an important distinction to make as well, where a lot of these studies would use completely pre-recorded movements, so asynchronous in the sense that they are not controlled by the person at all. And these disrupt both the sense of agency and ownership. However, you can look at another form of asynchronicity, which would be visual motor asynchronicity, so a visual motor delay, or what we might call latency between the movement of the user and the movement of the avatar. So it is still controlled by the user, but it's just moving in a delayed fashion. And that tends not to affect the sense of ownership as much as it does the sense of agency. And so we know that the agency seems to be quite sensitive then to even delays in the movement. So yeah, the agency depends quite a bit on the mapping of the motor commands to the virtual movement itself, but maybe not so much the sense of ownership. This gets more complex when we look at something like virtual appearance. And so as we spoke about briefly earlier, we had a good question. Sense of ownership has been shown to be quite robust to virtual bodies of different ages, different sizes, and different skin tones. So we know that participants have been able to take a sense of ownership over maybe smaller, larger, younger, different skin tone bodies. However, a sense of ownership does appear to be quite sensitive to anthropomorphic features. So if you've got things like disconnected hands or a skeletal hand or a robot hand, robot features, then we know that sense of ownership can start to be disrupted by this. And as I was saying earlier as well, where someone's talking about the feet or even disconnected hands, we know that visual discontinuity is quite important. So if where your hand should be connected to an arm, it's not the whole time, this would affect it, but not merely occluding information. So if you had put your hand through something, and now there's something blocking the arm that you can't see, but you know the arm is there, that doesn't seem to affect it as much. So it's actual genuine discontinuity of information that should be there but isn't. That can affect sense of ownership. There is a critical dissociation, again, between these sensory motor contingencies and the visual appearance, such that sense of agency seems to be quite robust to visual impairment. So if you're moving a skeleton hand or even something as a cursor like I'm moving now, it needs to look nothing like my actual body. But if I am moving it and it's moving in time with me, then I should still feel a sense of agency over this. Whereas ownership seems to be slightly more the other way around, where we've seen that maybe the hand not quite moving in time with our own movements, but so long as this hand does look quite anthropomorphic and human-like, I can still kind of feel a sense of ownership over this. So there's quite a dissociation there between what affects ownership and what affects agency in both. Then you've got like multimodal features in virtual reality. So you've got, synchronous touch being important for ownership and agency, as we've seen earlier anyway from the physical experiments. But these might be quite robust to even some incongruencies of visual and tactile information, should you still be in control over the movements, as long as there's a causal explanation for it. But of course, there are many other senses to consider, such as smell that we normally get from the physical world as well, and also touch feedback in general, and auditory as well. And we know that these can affect it. There have been some studies that looked at smell, but usually a modified kind of smell, which can affect sense of agency and ownership, and then auditory signals as well. The first person and third person is also quite an interesting one for appearance. We can actually feel ownership and agency even in third person over a body, even though in real life we typically see everything in first person. But maybe that kind of extra, there's an added thing of first person does give a slightly bigger benefit to agency and ownership. However, then because you can feel more ownership and agency in first person, when you are in first person, these kind of sensory discrepancies may affect you more, and so need to be taken more into consideration. So that's kind of what we might know so far about the virtual self. Hope that makes sense. Or any little questions?
I think we will just move on with we just carry on and then ask answer on all the questions later.
Okay.
When we've done the slides. So anyone want to ask any questions, please type your questions in our chatting box, and George will answer the questions later. Yeah.
Okay. So are there wider applications then of this, the virtual self, and kind of understanding the self in VR? So we know that in training environments, these sensory motor contingencies, so when the movements are mapping well with the user, this can reduce cognitive load. So the user doesn't need to think so much about all these discrepancies that are going on, and then they can actually, that benefits them in training environments where they perform better and so on. Agency and immersion impacts implicit learning and visualization of the human body. And you can also use positive or modified feedback to enhance kind of agency and learning. So you might actually purposely manipulate the feedback that someone is receiving to positively reward them based on their movement. And this can be beneficial in stuff like neurorehabilitation, where someone has some sort of motor impairment due to post-stroke or other sort of paralyses. And virtual environments, first and foremost, are a great way for rehabilitating this, because you can, put them in environments which you just cannot do in the physical world. And so it makes the training more engaging and more fun. And then so making sure that we have understood onboarding the self into VR is important, so that we can fully maximize or optimize these training methods. And then from there, so we know that maybe positively rewarding their feedback or manipulating it to maybe be stronger than what it was would aid then this kind of rehabilitation of motor movement. Even other forms of neurorehabilitation, such as neuropathic pain relief. So yeah, these kind of signals of pain that people can receive due to neuro functions sort of thing. I find hard to explain that. But we can reduce people's neuropathic pain by, so if they're paralyzed, I think it was these participants, and they can't get up and walk, and they feel this neuropathic pain in their back. if you show them virtual imagery of, if you put them in VR and they are kind of, they've taken ownership and agency over an avatar, and then the avatar is like walking, and they are viewing this even passively, it can reduce their kind of pain that they feel. So that's kind of another wider application in that aspect. And if you combine this with some neuro methods of direct current stimulation, you can have longer lasting effects as well. Yeah, and it's obviously used. So we talked about training earlier, where you might see surgical training or medicine training, or it's even used in the real world environments as well. So stuff like agency and responsibility becomes important there. Yeah, and then you've got full body illusions, which can be used to treat kind of bodily dysmorphia things, stuff like anorexia nervosa, and you can manipulate people's body image and try and improve those kind of symptoms from there. Stuff like social aspects as well, so we can reduce kind of implicit biases, so you can see where someone might have taken ownership and agency over an avatar. We can do stuff like reduce implicit biases, whether it's towards certain races or I think there was a study on elements of domestic abuse where you can increase people's empathy towards certain situations. So we know that ownership and agency has certain other benefits that can do good for certain people's attitudes outside of VR as well. So you can use it to impact their physical world and their attitudes in the physical world as well. So there are many wider applications of using virtual reality. And that's why it's quite important as well to understand exactly how to optimize the virtual self, so you can get the best benefits out of these. Okay. So then how do we approach the research? So we want to use this kind of interdisciplinary approach, as we were saying. So we want to take the benefits of psychological researches. So we want to get psychologists and stuff to work with computer scientists together, so that we can fully understand the human aspect and how that interacts with the system aspect. And it works quite well with the goal of execution and evaluation model, where it's human-computer interaction. So we need to understand both the human side and the computer side and collaborate together. And this also has implications for the VR products as well as the user themselves. So yeah, we definitely want to take that kind of interdisciplinary approach. And then, so what would a theoretical framework and methodology look like? So we would first need to we need to come up with terminology and definitions. And so we need to understand that, or attempt to understand what it means to immerse the self in VR. Some have suggested it is a transfer of consciousness, such that you can exert influence in the virtual environment in a virtual body that you feel belongs to you. So does it mean that you've completely transferred your consciousnness into the virtual environment, and you now feel you're acting as yourself in that environment? So for example, you could argue whether that discrepancy is strong, so that if I am acting in the physical environment to cause an action in the virtual environment to then cause an effect, or is it that when I'm acting I'm seeing my actions in the virtual environment as immediate actions that are then causing effects? So it depends on the beliefs as well of the participant. So we would need to define the virtual self in that aspect, exactly what it means. And we need to ensure we're getting concepts and terminology in line with each other, because sometimes you see in VR research and psychological research, they're using different concepts and different terminology, and that can create kind of discrepancies in the research. So we'd need to come together in an interdisciplinary approach to define and move forward. And it might depend on the participants or the users' beliefs and awareness when they enter a virtual world. So some users might enter a virtual world with a complete belief and awareness that it's not real, or some go in with the aspect of kind of opening up to wonder if it is real, and that's all this kind of distinction. And so the difference in a user's belief and awareness of what's real or not real in the virtual world might affect how or might modulate how much the effects of the virtual environment actually affect the user. So it might depend on the user's level of belief and awareness in general. And then we might want to look at the methodology. So it'll be good to apply these kind of more robust scientific measures of agency, such as the intentional binding, where we look at people's perception of time during actions and effects. This will give nice implicit measures to not just look at VR research using kind of self-report, but also try and look at the more implicit experiences that are actually going on in VR. And that goes for ownership as well, using things like proprioceptive drift and these physiological responses to threat, as opposed to just using kind of self-report. So we want to capture both sides of the experience of agency and ownership, so implicit and explicit. And on the other side as well, using kind of computer scientists and VR specialists, we can work to create environments that allow us to use these measures in a more ecologically valid situation as well, such as something be able to program themselves. And so this is why it becomes important to work together again. Yeah, so that's kind of what that would look like in terms of theoretically methodology, using this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And so what can we conclude and what are the future directions from here? So, yeah, we know that I guess to kind of just conclude it there, but we can conclude that the virtual self, like understanding minimal self-awareness is important to the virtual self because it goes beyond just our thoughts and our memories and intentions to understanding the self as an immediate subjective experience and how this transfers into virtual body and actions and effects. We know that conceptually in VR research is often looked at as embodiment as a whole, but as we've seen from the cognitive neuroscience perspective, sense of agency and ownership is often quite separate and can be dissociated and can be measured in more implicit ways as explicit ways. And so this could be taken into account as well. We know that this has good use. We have good use for VR in psychological research in that we can systematically manipulate the feedback that we receive on our actions and effects and our bodily sensations. And then we can understand more about the person. And then with this kind of research, we can also use it to understand more about VR and what the user needs or what affects the user when interacting with virtual environments. And so we kind of want to move forward from an interdisciplinary perspective and get psychologists and computer scientists or VR specialists to work together to fully optimize the virtual self. And yeah, that is the last slide.
Yeah, that's great. So we have the questions from the chatting box, which I already sent to your WhatsApp. You can just see the last like full text messages. Forget about the picture thing. So you just go through the 4 text messages. Start with the hero movies there. So that is the 4 questions in our chatting box.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's one here that says, is it from Rumi Liu? It says, is it possible to deceive the brain into thinking that such tools as brushes, music instruments, chopsticks, knives, and forks are part of the body? More broadly, can the brain think that something different from the hands and feet is part of the body? That is an interesting question. There has actually been quite a bit of research on that, even in the real world. And I think the short answer is yes. You can I'll go back to one of these slides. You can actually train the brain to believe that an extension, a tool, typically one that, let's say, is extended, is kind of taken on as part of the body. And then with that, we act in accordance of that as well. So I think there were some studies done in the physical world where people were trained with the tool whether it's something that's extended and they use to pick up certain items. And then they tend to, after so much training with it, actually start adjusting their movements, even when they don't have the tool in their hand, to be further away from certain objects they would normally be closer to, or certain things. So it's yeah, that's quite interesting, even at the level of, well, if you're using a controller in VR, do you start to take on that controller as something as an extension of your body? Because sometimes you're using controllers in VRs, but in VR, but in the virtual world, those controllers are actually hands moving. Well, I guess here we were looking at more interacting with your actual body, so using a hand tracking machine or sensors, so as your actual hands in the virtual environment. And then I guess it would be interesting to see then if you are using a tool in the virtual environment that you've picked up with your virtual hand, do you start to take ownership over the tool as well, or is it just kind of agency that you're feeling with the tool? So it'll be interesting to see if that transfers into the virtual environment as well. Maybe one or two questions. So if we give the higher agent, so this is from Yuan. So it's if we give higher agency to the user in virtual reality, is it possible to cause users to have wrong perceptions? For example, blurring the boundaries between reality and virtual world. Trying to make sure I understand that correctly. If that's so, if we are assigning, is this if we are assigning agency to an external virtual avatar? It depends then if you manipulate someone's control over the avatar to the extent if there's something in the program which causes the avatar to do something that wasn't in line with the user's intention, can you cause them to have wrong perceptions? Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer there is maybe yes as well. So we know that if you modify certain feedback, like we were saying in the neurorehabilitation, where what you might do in this example is if you can have their avatar. So if you're trying to rehabilitate someone's motor function, you might have their avatar move, the velocity of their movement and the extent of their movement might be increased compared to their actual movement. So whereas if I move my hand this much, normally the avatar should move exactly in accordance with that. But if you're trying to train someone who is only moving their hand this much because that's all they're capable of, due to a motor impairment. And so if you have the avatar, while I move my hand this much, the avatar has actually moved further and has actually attained the goal that the user intended to get to. Then their perception over that might still feel like they still had that sense of agency. And that, well, I guess that's a more positive aspect where you modify what the avatar is doing relative to the user. So to give that positive aspect of reward, and whether it can be used in a negative aspect is an interesting one as well, where you might modify the feedback they get and it causes something the user doesn't want to happen, and whether that alters their perception of whether they were the agent during that interaction or not is an interesting one. An interesting follow-up from that as well is a social interaction. So we have seen some studies on virtual avatars responding in a human-like manner, should we say, to your actions and their effects as well. So it's also been looked at from a social perspective as well. But yeah, I guess the short answer is yes to that. You can alter someone's perceptions based on whether the action was actually in line or in correspondence to what they intended or not. I think there's another one here. Can't see the name, but it says if one day we can do almost everything.
From Wang Yuchen. Yeah, it's in Chinese language. It's from Wang Yuchen. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So it says if one day we can do almost everything in virtual reality, just like God, what could happen to our mind and society? That's a big question. It's a very good question. Yeah, so okay, that's a big question there. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if we are capable of doing, like you say, so much in virtual reality, and then within that virtual reality, we've optimized the virtual self to feel exactly like it is as if we are doing it. So we have taken ownership over the body, we've taken agency, and all the sensory signals are aligning. And And then, so while feeling like it really is us, ourselves in the virtual world, and yet we are capable of so much more, that does have interesting implications. Does that mean that when we exit the virtual reality, we feel less than in the physical world now? So what happens in the virtual world is having long-lasting effects when we take off the visor and we go back to the physical world. That is an interesting question and implication maybe we should consider before trying to completely optimize the self in the virtual world. And also, I think someone had spoke about this the other day about the addiction of it then. So if we are really, in the virtual world so often and it feels exactly like us, and yet we are capable of, well, what would seem like superpowers, then would we get kind of addicted to this feeling and maybe want to spend less time in the physical world as well? Because why would we, if the virtual world now really does feel like us in acting as ourselves in the world, and yet we can do so much more, why would you want to leave that world, I suppose? There has been some interesting studies, I think, on animals as well, where this even applies to, you can almost give like a positive delusion to animals of like happiness. I think they had put like VR goggles on the cows or something in the farm and put them in while the cows are, locked up in certain environments for the meat industry and so on. But if you put the VR goggles on them and they are actually seeing the field and so on, even in a virtual reality, then it increases their level of happiness. So there is that dissociation there with what you can feel in the virtual world compared to the physical. And yeah, it does lead to interesting ethical implications that I suppose should definitely be considered. So I guess that leads to an even larger interdisciplinary approach. So not necessarily just psychologists and computer scientists, but if we really do move towards such a what's the word, like a real virtual self in that sense, then we'd need to include like philosophers and lawyers and ethical bodies and implications to all of that. So yeah, that's a very big and interesting question.
Yeah, very good questions. And hopefully the cow with that VR environment can, you know, get more happy milk. Is it like a happy milk
Yeah,
production with the AR or
yeah,
VR
yeah,
thing? So towards the virtual self, hopefully the VR and the virtual world can help us actually find the real self instead of losing yourself. It will be a more advanced and fancy tool to help a human being, not over addiction or misused. Because after
mm,
all, the real world matters. Since our
mm,
family and friends, love and peace are all here, we cannot only stay there forever. Yes,
yeah,
so because of the COVID and the pandemic, this make us feel more real to stay together with family,
mm,
stay with the inner peace and love that really matters. No matter how the
yeah,
technology is developing, maybe something even more advanced than AR, VR later on, but still, as a human being, I think the peace and love still matters, since we're
yeah,
still that is part of the definition of human being, I would say, right? Yeah.
yeah. I guess that is quite interesting in the sense that obviously during the pandemic we had to use technology to interact with people, and that kind of made us realize even more how actually important the physical world is.
Yeah.
Like obviously the digital world, or I suppose VR technology isn't quite there yet, that we could have interacted with people in a virtual manner and maybe even felt and saw and
Mm,
interacted with. So that question is still a little bit unanswered, but it did kind of make us realize as amazing as the technology is, where we can now interact via distance and so on. It made me isn't quite the same. Yeah, that's quite interesting.
yeah. And the real fun is quite different than the virtual fun, I still think, right? The real
Mm.
fun, like making fun of the people in front of them in person, is different than in front of the camera, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for the sharing. But if there's